Every unmarried woman in England had one name on her lips that season: Duke Lysander Vance. The drawing rooms of Derbyshire whispered about him. The tea parlours of London ached for him. Mothers of eligible daughters wrote letters to his estate that went unanswered. Invitations to every ball, every country supper, every garden luncheon arrived at Oakhaven Manor by the sackful, and every single one was returned unopened. He had not attended a social gathering in 14 months. The gossip columns called him the Lonely Duke. They said his heart had been shattered by a woman whose name he refused to speak. They said he wandered the halls of his enormous country estate at night, unable to sleep, unable to forget. One particularly dramatic account in a Bath society paper claimed he kept a single white rose on his writing desk, a memorial to the love he had lost. It was, all of it, complete rubbish. But rubbish sells newspapers, and rubbish fills ballrooms with sighing young ladies who believe they alone possess the power to mend a broken man. On the morning of the 14th of April, 1814, the front doors of Oakhaven Estate opened for the first time in weeks. The housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, stood in the entrance hall with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "there is a woman here. She has a warrant." Lysander Vance stood at the top of the grand staircase in a wrinkled linen shirt, no cravat, and trousers that looked like he had slept in them. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that would have made every lady in Mayfair lose her composure, though the effect was entirely accidental. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, sitting at his desk, staring at columns of numbers that refused to add up to anything good. "A warrant," he repeated. "A ledger auditor's warrant, sir, signed by the Exchequer's office." He came down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. The great hall of Oakhaven was a cathedral of old money. Marble floors, oak-paneled walls lined with portraits of Vance ancestors stretching back 200 years, crystal chandeliers that caught the gray Derbyshire morning light and scattered it in pale ribbons across the ceiling. And standing in the middle of all that inherited grandeur, holding a leather document case against her chest like a shield, was a woman he had never seen before. She was not dressed like a society caller. Her traveling coat was dark gray wool, practical and unadorned. Her boots were muddied from the lane. Her hair was pinned back in a simple arrangement that suggested she had done it herself without a maid's help. She wore no jewelry except a thin brass chain around her neck that disappeared beneath her collar. She looked, Lysander thought, like someone who had come to work. "Miss Genevieve Thorne," she said, and her voice carried across the marble hall with the kind of clarity that suggested she was used to speaking in rooms full of men who did not want to listen. "I hold a certified auditor's warrant from the Bank of Whitmore and Sons, authorized under the direction of the Exchequer's Standing Commission on Fiduciary Oversight. I am here to examine the financial accounts of the Oakhaven estate." Lysander stopped at the foot of the staircase and studied her. She did not blush. She did not curtsy. She did not look at him the way women usually looked at him, which was with some mixture of longing and theatrical sympathy designed to make him believe they understood his suffering. She looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a patient who insists he is perfectly fine while bleeding through his shirt. "I was not informed of any audit," Lysander said. "You were informed 3 times by post," Genevieve replied. "The first letter was sent in January, the second in February. The third arrived 2 weeks ago with a note from the bank director himself requesting your cooperation. All 3 were returned unopened." She paused. "Along with, I am told, roughly 400 other pieces of correspondence." Mrs. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably near the door. Lysander said nothing for a long moment. Then he gestured vaguely toward the east corridor. "The household accounts are managed by my steward, Mr. Pemberton. He handles all—" "Mr. Pemberton resigned 7 months ago," Genevieve interrupted. "His replacement lasted 3 weeks before leaving without notice. You have had no steward since November." She opened her document case and pulled out a folded sheet of paper covered in neat, small handwriting. "In the absence of a steward, I examined the estate's banking records directly, which is how I discovered that for the past 11 months, Your estate has made a series of large, irregular transfers to 17 different accounts spread across 4 separate banking houses." The hall went very quiet. Lysander's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A door closing, a wall going up. "The transfers total just over £9,000, Genevieve continued, and now her voice had dropped slightly, as though she understood the weight of what she was saying. "That is more than twice the annual operating income of this estate. The money is leaving faster than it comes in. At the current rate, Your Grace, you will be unable to meet your quarterly obligations by midsummer." She folded the paper and returned it to her case. "I am not here because someone suspects you of wrongdoing," she said. "I am here because the bank that holds your family's accounts is alarmed. £9,000 does not simply vanish, it goes somewhere, and my task is to find out where." Lysander looked at her for a long time. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled once at his side, then relaxed. Then he smiled. It was a strange smile, tired and thin and completely empty of warmth. "Miss Thorne," he said, "I appreciate your diligence, truly, but my financial affairs are a private matter, and I assure you there is nothing irregular about them. Now, I would be happy to compensate you generously for your travel and your time, and I will send a letter to Whitmore & Sons explaining that no further inquiry is necessary." He reached into his coat and produced a small folded banknote. He held it out to her. Genevieve looked at the money. Then she looked at him. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "the last man who tried to buy my silence owed £40,000 to a shipping company in Liverpool and was running a false insurance scheme out of his wine cellar." She tilted her head. "He is currently living in a debtor's cottage in Suffolk. I would not recommend following his example." She tucked the document case under her arm and walked past him toward the east corridor. "I will need access to your private study," she called over her shoulder, "and the vault behind the bookcase on the second floor, the one your late father had built into the wall in 1797. Lysander stood perfectly still at the bottom of the staircase. She already knew about the vault. He closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, like a man who has just realized that the one secret he swore to carry alone has begun, very quietly, to unravel. The private study of Oakhaven Estate had not been properly cleaned in months. Dust sat thick on the windowsills. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn halfway, letting in just enough grey afternoon light to reveal the disorder underneath. Books lay open on every surface. Stacks of ledgers covered the writing desk, some of them bristling with torn paper markers. Ink bottles sat uncapped, their contents dried to black crusts. A cold cup of tea rested on the arm of a chair, forgotten so long ago that a thin film of mold had formed across the surface. Genevieve stood in the doorway and took it all in. This was the room of a man drowning. Lysander leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed. He had followed her upstairs in silence, and now he watched her the way a fox watches a hound that has found the right scent. "You have your warrant," he said. "Look through whatever you like. The household accounts, the tenant records, the quarterly reports. You will find them all perfectly ordinary." Genevieve moved to the desk and opened the first ledger. She turned pages slowly, running her finger along columns of figures. Rents collected from farmland, wages paid to household staff, repairs to the south wing roof, feed purchases for the stables. Everything balanced, every entry matched. The penmanship was careful, almost elegant. Too elegant. She closed the ledger and picked up another. Same handwriting, same precision. She opened a third, identical. "These are beautiful records," she said, setting the third book down. Lysander's expression remained flat. "Thank you. They are also completely useless." She turned to face him. "These are presentation ledgers, Your Grace, summary copies, the kind you prepare when you know someone might eventually come looking. Every figure is rounded, every transaction is vague. There is not a single vendor name, not a single receipt reference, not a single banking house identified anywhere in these pages. She tapped the cover of the nearest book. These tell me what you spent. They tell me nothing about where the money actually went. Lysander uncrossed his arms. The composure he had been wearing like armor since the morning began to show its first crack. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Miss Thorne, I have cooperated with your inspection. I have opened my study. I have given you access to my records. If the figures are in order, then I fail to see what further business you have here.
The figures are in order, Genevieve agreed. That is precisely the problem. Real accounts are messy. They have corrections, adjustments, overpayments, disputed invoices. These ledgers read like a novel. Somebody sat down and wrote them from beginning to end with the intention of making everything look clean. She paused. Which means the real records are somewhere else. Lysander said nothing. Genevieve walked to the bookcase along the eastern wall. It was an enormous piece of furniture, floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes arranged by size. She studied the shelves for a moment, then reached up and pulled out a thick volume on the third row. Behind it, the wood panel was slightly discolored, a shade darker than the surrounding oak. Years of careful handling had worn the finish away in the shape of a handprint. She pressed the panel. Something clicked behind the wall. A small section of the bookcase swung inward on hidden brass hinges, revealing a narrow iron door with a combination lock built into its face. Lysander pushed off the wall. How did you know about that? Your father had this safe installed in 1797 by a locksmith named Hargrove, who operated out of Sheffield, Genevieve said, already turning the combination dial. Hargrove kept meticulous records of every commission. When I was given this assignment, I pulled his workshop logs from the trade archive in Derby. He noted the combination in his personal ledger because your father never collected the duplicate key. The lock turned. The iron door opened with a low groan. Inside the safe were 3 leather-bound books, thinner than the ones on the desk, with no titles on their spines. Beneath them sat a wooden box filled with loose papers, receipts, and handwritten notes on torn foolscap. Genevieve lifted out the first book and opened it. The room changed. These were the real accounts. Raw, unpolished, written in a hand that shook slightly on certain pages. The entries told a story that the presentation ledgers on the desk had been designed to hide. Monthly payments of £200 to a family in Sussex, 150 to a tradesman in Manchester, 75 to a widow in Cheltenham, 60 to a retired clerk in Norwich. The list went on, page after page, name after name. Dozens of recipients, hundreds of individual transfers, every one of them marked with the same notation in the margin, written in Lysander's own handwriting. Restitution. Genevieve turned more pages. The pattern held across months. The amounts never decreased. If anything, they grew larger as Lysander calculated interest owed, adjusted for inflation, added compensatory sums for families who had suffered the longest. She reached the final page of the third book. At the bottom, circled twice in heavy ink, was a single figure. The remaining balance of the Vance family fortune. £412. Genevieve closed the book gently and set it back on the shelf inside the safe. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the iron door, her back to Lysander. "You are paying them back," she said. Lysander's voice came from behind her, rough and low. "Close the safe, Miss Thorne. Every family your father cheated, every penny he stole, you have been returning it yourself, out of your own inheritance, for nearly a year." I said, "Close it." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, and for the first time since she had arrived that morning, the mask was gone. He looked exhausted. He looked hollowed out. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight so enormous that his bones had begun to bend under it, and the only thing keeping him upright was the fact that no one else knew. £412, Genevieve said quietly. That is all you have left. Your estate generates roughly 3,000 a year in rents, and you are spending more than twice that on these payments. You are less than 6 months from losing everything. Lysander met her eyes. Then I lose everything. The words hung in the dusty air between them, like something final.
Genevieve picked up her document case from the desk.
I am going to Derby tomorrow to report to my employer. I will tell him what I have found. She held up a hand before he could speak. I will also tell him that there is no fraud, no crime, no irregularity worth prosecuting. Only a man dismantling his own life, one payment at a time, for reasons I do not yet fully understand. She walked to the door and stopped. But I will understand them, Your Grace. That much I promise you. She left the study without looking back. Lysander stood alone in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the evidence of his slow, deliberate ruin, and said nothing at all.
The coaching inn on Derby's High Street was called the Pelican, and at noon on a Tuesday it was loud enough to make thinking difficult. Coach passengers crowded the front parlour, waiting for the 1 o'clock departure to Nottingham. A pair of wool merchants argued over prices at a corner table. Serving girls moved between benches carrying trays of bread, cold meat, and ale. The fireplace roared despite the mild April weather because the innkeeper believed a warm room encouraged a thirsty crowd, and a thirsty crowd spent money. Genevieve sat at a small table near the back window, her document case open beside a cup of tea she had barely touched. Across from her sat Mr. Edwin Halford, Senior Director of the Bank of Whitmore and Sons, and the man who had sent her to Oakhaven. Halford was 53, grey at the temples, and built like a man who spent his evenings eating well and his mornings regretting it. He wore a fine navy coat that strained at the buttons and carried a silver-topped walking stick that he used more for authority than balance. He was, by most measures, a cautious and reasonable banker. He was also, at this particular moment, deeply irritated. "Restitution," he repeated, turning the word over in his mouth like something sour.
That is what the records show, Genevieve said. Every transfer corresponds to a family name. I cross-referenced 11 of them against public directories before I left the estate. They are real people, real addresses, tradesmen, shopkeepers, small landowners, the kind of people who would have invested modest savings with a titled gentleman and trusted his word. Halford tapped his walking stick against the floor. "And you believe the late Duke defrauded these families?" "I believe Lysander Vance believes it. The payments are methodical. He has calculated principal amounts, interest, and adjusted figures going back more than a decade in some cases. This is the work of someone who has studied his father's dealings in extraordinary detail and concluded that a great wrong was done." "Concluded?" Halford leaned forward. "Miss Thorne, the late Duke of Vance was one of our most respected clients. He held accounts with us for 22 years. Are you suggesting that this bank facilitated a fraud?" Genevieve met his gaze without flinching. "I am suggesting that a man is paying back money he believes was stolen. Whether the original crime is real or imagined, the financial consequence is the same. The Vance estate is being emptied. Within months, there will be nothing left to hold accounts with anyone." Halford sat back and rubbed his forehead. Through the window behind him, Genevieve could see the high street filling with the usual midday traffic. A flower seller pushed a cart along the cobblestones. 2 women in matching bonnets paused outside a milliner's shop, admiring something in the window. "What do you recommend?" Halford asked. "I recommend that I continue the audit. The presentation ledgers are fabricated summaries designed to satisfy casual inspection. The real accounts are hidden, and they tell a different story entirely. If the late Duke did run a fraudulent scheme, there will be traces of it in older banking records, trade guild filings, and investment contracts. I can trace the full picture, but I need time." Halford studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat, produced a sealed envelope, and slid it across the table. "You have 3 weeks, he said. "After that, the bank's quarterly review board will demand a formal report, and I will need something on paper that does not make us look like fools."
Genevieve took the envelope and tucked it into her case. Halford stood, adjusted his coat, and picked up his walking stick. "One more thing," he said, lowering his voice. "Be discreet. The Duke of Vance is the most talked-about bachelor in 3 counties. If word gets out that his fortune is gone, it will cause a panic among every family that has lent him credit, extended him trade, or pinned their daughter's future on a proposal that will never come." He tipped his hat and left through the front door, disappearing into the high street crowd. Genevieve sat alone at the table and finished her tea. She had expected Halford to be alarmed. She had expected questions, concern, perhaps even urgency. What she had not expected was the envelope. It meant the bank already suspected something. Halford had not sent her to Oakhaven on a routine inspection. He had sent her because the numbers had already begun to worry him, and he wanted someone sharp enough to find the truth without causing a scandal. She closed her document case and stood to leave. At the front of the inn, near the coaching entrance, a cluster of local women had gathered around a broadsheet pinned to the notice board. Genevieve passed close enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "They say he is waiting for the perfect woman," one of them said, a butcher's wife with flour still on her apron. "That he will not settle for anything less than true devotion." "My cousin's girl saw him riding through Matlock last autumn," another added, a younger woman clutching a shopping basket. "She said he looked straight at her and smiled. She has not stopped talking about it since." "I heard he is saving his fortune for a grand wedding," the first woman continued, "that he plans to propose at the Midsummer Ball in London, and that the ring is already made, a sapphire, they say, as blue as his eyes." Genevieve stopped walking. She turned and looked at the broadsheet on the board. It was a society column reprinted from a London paper, and the headline read, "The Lonely Duke. Will this be the season he finally opens his heart?" Below it was a sketch of Lysander that bore only a passing resemblance to the man she had met yesterday. The artist had given him a wistful, romantic expression, the kind that belonged on the cover of a sentimental novel. He looked noble, tragic, and impossibly handsome. He looked nothing like the exhausted, hollow-eyed man standing in a dusty study surrounded by evidence of his own financial destruction. Genevieve stared at the sketch for a long moment. These women, these gossip columns, the entire breathless fantasy that surrounded Lysander Vance was built on air. They imagined a lonely heart waiting to be rescued. They imagined wealth being saved for some grand romantic gesture. They imagined a man who needed love. The truth was simpler and far more painful. He did not need love. He needed an accountant. And he was running out of time. She pulled her coat tighter, stepped out into the high street, and began the walk to the coaching office to book passage to London. The post road from Derby to London was a 12-hour journey on a good day, and this was not a good day. Rain had swept across the Midlands overnight, turning the packed dirt stretches between the toll roads into shallow rivers of mud. Genevieve's hired carriage, a modest 2-horse affair with a cracked leather seat and windows that rattled in their frames, crawled along at a pace that would have embarrassed a walking man. She did not mind. She had spread her papers across the opposite seat and was working through the figures again, checking her arithmetic against the entries she had copied from Lysander's hidden ledgers. The numbers told a grim and consistent story. 11 months of payments, 17 separate families, a personal fortune being fed into the ground like seed corn that would never be harvested. The carriage lurched sideways as the left wheel dropped into a rut, scattering her papers across the floor. Genevieve swore quietly, gathered them up, and was still sorting pages when she heard hooves approaching fast from behind. A rider, coming at a gallop despite the mud. She leaned toward the window and looked back along the road. Through the drizzle, she could make out a single figure on a dark bay horse, riding hard with his coat flapping behind him and no hat on his head. He gained on the carriage quickly, pulled alongside, and shouted something to the driver that Genevieve could not hear over the rain. The carriage slowed to a stop. The door opened. Lysander Vance stood in the road, soaked from head to boots, breathing hard.
His horse stamped and snorted behind him, its flanks steaming in the cold morning air. "Get in," Genevieve said, because there was nothing else to say to a man standing in a rainstorm who had clearly ridden 10 miles to catch her. He climbed into the carriage and pulled the door shut behind him. Water dripped from his hair, his coat, his gloves. He sat on the opposite bench among the scattered papers and said nothing for a full minute while he caught his breath. Genevieve waited. "You cannot give those figures to Halford," Lysander said finally. "I have already given him a preliminary summary. He knows about the transfers." "The transfers, yes. Does he know about the families, the names?" "I told him the payments correspond to real people. I did not provide a list." Lysander exhaled. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and stared at the carriage floor. Mud from his boots pooled on the boards. "Those families have suffered enough," he said. "If the bank starts making inquiries, sending letters, dispatching agents to verify my claims, those people will be dragged into something they never asked for. Some of them do not even know where the money is coming from. They receive an envelope once a month with no name and no return address. They think it is charity from a local parish or a benevolent society." "And you prefer it that way?" "I insist on it." Genevieve studied him. The romantic sketch in the Derby broadsheet had made him look noble and distant, like a character from a poem. Sitting across from her now, with rain dripping off his jaw and desperation in his voice, he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff and trying to convince someone it was solid ground. "Your Grace," she said, "I am not here to expose those families. I am here because a bank wants to know why one of its largest accounts is hemorrhaging money. If I do not give Halford a satisfactory explanation, he will send someone else, and the next auditor may not care about your reasons." Lysander lifted his head. "What do you want to know?" "Everything, starting with your father." The carriage jolted forward again as the driver found firmer road. Rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythms. For a long time, the only sounds were the horses, the wheels, and the weather. Then Lysander spoke. "My father was a brilliant man, charming, generous with his time, his conversation, his hospitality. People adored him. He could walk into a room full of strangers, and within an hour, every one of them would feel as though they had known him for years." He paused. He used that gift to steal from them. Genevieve said nothing. She let him continue. "It started small. Private investment opportunities. He would approach families at social gatherings, tradesmen at guild dinners, retired officers at their clubs. He told them he had identified a shipping venture, or a mining concern, or a canal project that was guaranteed to return double their investment within a year. He was a duke. His word was his bond. They gave him their savings without hesitation." "And the ventures were real?" "Some of them. Enough to pay early returns and keep the scheme alive, but the majority of the money went straight into his personal accounts. He used it to maintain the estate, to fund his lifestyle, to keep up appearances. By the time he died 3 years ago, he had taken roughly £12,000 from honest people who trusted him." £12,000. Genevieve absorbed the figure. For a duke with land and rents, it was a manageable sum spread over decades. For the families who had given it, shopkeepers and tradesmen and widows living on fixed incomes, it was everything. "How did you find out?" she asked. "His papers. After the funeral, I went through his study and found a private journal hidden beneath the floorboards. He had recorded every transaction, every name, every amount, every lie he told to secure the investment. I think some part of him kept the journal as a kind of confession, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the arithmetic of it." Lysander's voice had gone flat. The anger was old, Genevieve realized. Whatever fury he had felt upon discovering his father's crimes had long since burned down to something colder and heavier. Shame, perhaps, or duty. "I could not undo what he did," Lysander said. "I could not bring him back and force him to answer for it. The only thing I could do was return what was taken.
Every pound, every shilling, however long it took. Even if it destroys you. He looked at her across the narrow carriage, and for the first time there was something almost like relief in his expression. The relief of a man who has been holding a secret so long that simply hearing someone else say it aloud loosens something in his chest. "It is already destroying me, Miss Thorne. I made my peace with that a long time ago." The carriage rolled on through the rain toward London, carrying two people who now shared a truth that the rest of England was too busy dreaming to see. The Guildhall of the Worshipful Company of Merchant Traders sat at the end of a narrow lane off Cheapside, wedged between a printer's shop and a warehouse that smelled permanently of tar and tobacco. It was an old building, older than most of the street around it, with blackened stone walls and windows so small that even on a bright afternoon the rooms inside required candles. Genevieve had been inside since 9 that morning. The Guild's archive occupied a long, low-ceilinged room on the second floor, lined from wall to wall with wooden shelves holding bound ledgers, trade registers, and investment filings going back 40 years. A single clerk, an elderly man named Pettigrew, who moved with the careful slowness of someone whose knees had long since stopped cooperating, had pulled every volume she requested and stacked them on a reading table near the only window that admitted useful light. By early afternoon, Genevieve had filled 6 pages of her own notebook with cross-references. Lysander's account had been precise. His father, the late Duke Aldrich Vance, had solicited private investments from tradesmen and merchants under the guise of joint commercial ventures. The Guild records confirmed the existence of at least 9 such ventures registered between 1799 and 1811. Canal shares, wool export partnerships, tin mining cooperatives in Cornwall. 3 of the 9 had been legitimate operations that produced modest returns for their investors. The other 6 existed only on paper. Registration fees had been paid, articles of partnership had been filed, quarterly reports had been submitted to the Guild, showing healthy profits and projected dividends. Every one of those reports had been fabricated. Genevieve laid the documents side by side on the reading table. The fraudulent ventures followed an identical pattern. Investors would be recruited through personal introductions, always in private settings, always by the Duke himself. Initial contributions would be collected and deposited into accounts held at different banking houses. For the first year, returns would be paid out of new investors' deposits, creating the appearance of a functioning enterprise. By the second year, the payments would slow. By the third, the venture would be quietly dissolved, with a polite letter explaining that market conditions had rendered the project unviable. Investors would absorb their losses as the cost of doing business and move on. It was elegant, patient, and deeply cruel. What made it worse was the size of the individual investments. These were not wealthy men gambling on speculative ventures. The average contribution was between £50 and £150. For a merchant operating a modest shop, that sum might represent years of careful saving. For a widow reinvesting her late husband's estate, it might be everything she had. Genevieve closed the last Guild ledger and sat back in her chair. Lysander's journal entries matched. Every family he was repaying appeared somewhere in these records. His calculations of principal and interest were sound. In several cases, he had actually overestimated what was owed and was paying back more than his father had taken. The mathematics of his repayment plan, however, were a disaster. She opened her notebook and ran the figures one more time, hoping she had made an error somewhere. She had not. Lysander's estate generated approximately £3,200 per year in rents and agricultural income. His household operating costs, even stripped to the bare minimum he had been running on, consumed roughly £800. That left £2,400 available for restitution payments. He was currently paying out £4,600. The difference was being covered by selling off personal assets. Paintings, silver, furniture, horses. The hidden ledgers had recorded each sale in Lysander's careful hand, always through private dealers, always quietly, always at prices well below market value. because speed mattered more than profit. At the current rate, he would exhaust every sellable asset within 8 weeks. After that, the estate itself would have to be mortgaged. After that, there would be nothing left at all. Genevieve stared at the numbers until the candle on her table burned low and Pettigrew appeared at her shoulder to ask if she would be needing anything further.
"One thing," she said. "These 6 fraudulent ventures. The articles of partnership list the Duke of Vance as the sole principal in every case, but a scheme this size, running for 12 years across multiple banking houses, would require someone to manage the accounts while the Duke was occupied with recruitment. Deposits, withdrawals, transfers between institutions, that is daily work. He could not have done it alone and maintained the social calendar necessary to keep finding new investors." Pettigrew blinked his watery eyes. "You are suggesting there was a second party?" "I am suggesting it is worth looking. Do you have signature records for the account transactions? Authorized representatives on the banking correspondence?" The old clerk thought for a moment, then shuffled to a shelf near the back wall and returned with a slim, dust-covered folio. "Authorization ledger," he said. "Every venture registered with the Guild must declare its officers and any agents empowered to act on financial matters." Genevieve opened the folio and turned to the first of the 6 fraudulent ventures. The entry listed the Duke of Vance as principal and sole officer. She turned to the second, same listing. The third, the same. The fourth entry stopped her. Below the Duke's name, in smaller script added at a later date, was a second authorized signatory, someone who had been granted full power to deposit, withdraw, and transfer funds on behalf of the venture. The name was Sir Edmund Fairlie. Genevieve did not recognize it. She copied the name into her notebook, along with the date of the authorization and the specific venture it was attached to. Then she checked the remaining 2 fraudulent entries. Sir Edmund Fairlie appeared in both of them. She closed the folio and returned it to Pettigrew. "This man, Fairlie, is he known to the Guild?" Pettigrew tilted his head. "Sir Edmund Fairlie? Oh, certainly. Very well known. He is one of the most prominent gentlemen in London society, a frequent guest at court, close friend of the Duke of Vance, as I recall. The current Duke, that is." Genevieve's pen stopped moving. A close friend of Lysander. Someone who had been involved in the fraud from the beginning, who had handled the money, who had profited from the scheme alongside the late Duke, and who was now, apparently, still standing comfortably in London society while Lysander tore his own life apart paying for a crime that had never been his to carry alone. She gathered her papers, thanked Pettigrew, and walked out into the fading London afternoon with a new question burning in her chest. How much of Lysander's guilt belonged to someone else entirely? The Kensington Tea Parlour was the kind of establishment where women went to be seen drinking tea rather than to actually drink it. Crystal chandeliers hung from a painted ceiling. The tables were draped in ivory linen and set with porcelain so fine it was nearly transparent. Flowers arrived fresh each morning from a hothouse in Richmond, arranged in silver vases that reflected the candlelight in soft, warm circles. The chairs were upholstered in pale blue silk, and the room smelled faintly of jasmine and expensive gossip. Genevieve had not chosen to come here. She had received a note that morning at her lodgings in Holborn, delivered by a footman in a green and gold livery she did not recognize. The card inside was printed on thick cream paper with an embossed crest. It read, "Miss Thorne, I should very much like to make your acquaintance over tea this evening. A table has been reserved under my name at the Kensington Parlour, 7 o'clock. I trust you will attend. Lady Lucinda Ashworth." There had been no question mark at the end. It was a summons dressed in politeness, and Genevieve had considered ignoring it entirely. But the name Ashworth had appeared twice in the Guild records she had been studying, and curiosity outweighed irritation. She arrived at 7 wearing her best working dress, which was dark green wool with a modest lace collar. It was clean and well-fitted, and entirely wrong for a room full of women wearing silk and pearls. She did not care. Lady Lucinda was already seated at the reserved table near the center of the room, positioned with the kind of deliberate precision that ensured every other guest could observe her. She was perhaps 30, fair-haired, with sharp cheekbones and a smile that seemed permanently fixed in place, as though it had been applied each morning like rouge and would be removed each evening with a cloth. Two other women sat with her,
both younger, both dressed in matching shades of lavender, both looking at Genevieve with the kind of polite curiosity that was really just well-mannered suspicion.
"Miss Thorne," Lady Lucinda said, extending her hand without rising. "How good of you to come. Please, sit." Genevieve sat. Tea was poured. Small pastries were offered on a tiered silver tray. Genevieve took a cup and left the pastries alone. "I must confess," Lady Lucinda began, stirring her tea with a tiny silver spoon. "I had heard your name several times before I thought to write. Apparently, you have been spending a great deal of time at Oakhaven Estate, and a great deal of time asking questions about the Duke of Vance's private affairs." "I am conducting a financial audit," Genevieve said. "It is my profession." "Your profession?" Lady Lucinda repeated the word as though tasting it.
One of the lavender women exchanged a glance with the other.
"How very modern. And does your profession often require you to spend multiple days in the private company of an unmarried gentleman?" Genevieve set down her teacup. "My profession requires me to examine accounts and trace financial irregularities. The marital status of the account holder is not relevant to the arithmetic." Lady Lucinda's smile widened, but her eyes did not change. "Forgive me, Miss Thorne. I do not mean to question your competence. I am sure you are very good at what you do. But I want to be plain with you, because I think we are both women who appreciate directness." She leaned forward slightly.
Lysander Vance is the most sought-after bachelor in England. He is a man of extraordinary character who has endured great personal sorrow, and there are many women of quality, women of standing, who care deeply about his well-being. When a stranger arrives at his estate with questions about his money and his private business, it causes concern. Surely you understand.
"I understand that a bank sent me to do a job," Genevieve said. "And I understand that the Duke's financial situation is a matter between him, his accounts, and the institution that holds them. I do not see how it concerns anyone else." The temperature at the table dropped by several degrees. The two lavender women stopped pretending to eat their pastries. Lady Lucinda set down her spoon. "Let me be clearer then. There are people in this city who have invested considerable effort in cultivating a relationship with the Duke. Social introductions, charitable invitations, carefully arranged encounters. These things take time and delicacy. And there is a growing feeling among certain circles that your presence at Oakhaven is disrupting that progress." "Disrupting it how?" "By filling his head with numbers and concerns that distract him from the life he ought to be living. The Duke should be attending balls, accepting invitations, and re-entering society. Instead, by all accounts, he has spent the past week locked in his study with a woman who counts other people's money for a living." Genevieve felt something tighten behind her ribs. She recognized it from years of sitting in rooms where men in expensive coats told her that the figures were not her concern. It was the particular anger that comes from being underestimated by someone who has never once been required to earn a shilling. She folded her hands on the table. "Lady Lucinda," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The Duke of Vance is a grown man who makes his own decisions about how he spends his time. If he has chosen to attend to his financial affairs rather than attend your parties, that is his right. And if his accounts reveal something that requires serious attention, then the kindest thing anyone can do for him is address it honestly, rather than pretend it does not exist, because the truth might spoil the season." Lady Lucinda's smile finally faltered, just for a moment. A flicker of something hard and cold passed behind her eyes before the composure returned. "I see," she said softly. "Well, I have said what I came to say. I trust you will think carefully about the consequences of continuing your inquiries. London society has a long memory, Miss Thorne, and it does not forgive easily." She lifted her teacup and sipped delicately, signaling that the conversation was over. Genevieve stood. She left a coin on the table for the tea, which she knew was unnecessary and slightly insulting in a place where guests never saw a bill. She did not care about that either. She walked out into the cool evening air of Kensington High Street, her hands shaking very slightly at her sides. Lady Lucinda saw Lysander as a prize, a romantic trophy to be won through persistence and social maneuvering. She had no idea that the fortune she imagined sharing was already gone. She had no idea that the lonely, tragic Duke she wanted to save was already saving everyone except himself. And somewhere in London, Sir Edmund Fairlie was living comfortably on money that should have been part of that restitution. Genevieve hailed a cab and gave the driver an address in St. James. She had a vault to visit. The private banking house of Mercer, Tate and Sallow occupied a narrow stone building on a quiet street behind St. James's Palace. It was the kind of bank that did not advertise its existence. There was no sign above the door, no brass plate on the wall, no indication whatsoever that behind its plain facade sat one of the largest private deposit vaults in London. Genevieve had arranged access through Halford, who had written a letter of introduction on Bank of Whitmore stationery that opened doors other auditors could not reach. The head clerk at Mercer, Tate and Sallow, a pinched man named Coombs, who wore spectacles so thick his eyes appeared to swim behind them, had agreed to let her examine the records she needed on one condition: she had to come after hours. The bank's clients, Coombs explained, were men of extraordinary discretion. They would not appreciate learning that their records were being handled by an outside auditor during business hours, when they might walk in and witness it. Midnight was offered. Midnight was accepted. Lysander had insisted on coming. He arrived at the bank's side entrance at 11:45, dressed in a dark coat with the collar turned up. Genevieve was already inside, seated at a long oak table in the underground vault, surrounded by deposit ledgers that Coombs had laid out with the reluctant precision of a man. "You did not need to come," Genevieve said, when Lysander descended the narrow stone steps into the vault. "These are my father's records. If there is something in them, I should see it first." She could not argue with that. The vault was cold and damp, carved out of the London clay beneath the building's foundations. Iron shelves lined the walls, holding locked metal boxes and bound registers arranged by year. 2 oil lanterns sat on the table, casting a warm orange light that swayed gently with the draft from the stairwell. The shadows moved along the walls like restless guests. Coombs brought the final stack of ledgers, set them on the table with a disapproving thud, and retreated upstairs, leaving them alone. They worked in silence for the first hour. Genevieve had brought her notebook and the list of the 6 fraudulent ventures registered at the Guildhall. Each venture had maintained accounts at different banking houses to avoid drawing attention. 3 of them, however, had routed funds through Mercer, Tate and Sallow at various points between 1802 and 1810. She traced the deposits first, money coming in from investors, recorded under the venture names. The amounts matched the guild filings. So far, unremarkable. Then she followed the withdrawals. This was where the pattern broke. In a legitimate investment venture, withdrawals would go toward operational expenses, equipment purchases, wages, materials. The records would show payments to suppliers, contractors, and shipping agents. The money would flow outward into the economy and leave a trail. These withdrawals went to 2 places. Half went directly into the personal account of the late Duke Aldrich Vance, exactly as Lysander had described. The other half went to a second personal account. Genevieve turned the ledger so Lysander could read the entry. "Account holder," she said, pointing to the line. "Sir Edmund Fairlie." Lysander stared at the page. The lantern flame caught his face from below, sharpening the angles of his jaw and deepening the shadows under his eyes. "Edmund," he said quietly. "You know him well?" "He was my father's closest friend. After my father died, Edmund was the first person to visit the estate. He sat in my study and told me how much he admired my father's character. He offered to help manage the transition of affairs. He said he wanted to honor their friendship by looking after me. Lysander's voice was carefully controlled, but something in it had begun to fray at the edges. He has dined at my table 12 times since then. He writes to me regularly. He sends gifts at Christmas. Genevieve pulled another ledger from the stack and opened it to a page she had already marked. The withdrawals to Fairlie's account total just over £5,800 across the 3 ventures held at this bank. That is nearly half of the total fraud your father committed. Lysander pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the far wall of the vault, placed both hands flat against the cold stone, and stood there with his head bowed.
"I have been destroying myself to repay £12,000, he said, "and half of it is sitting in the pocket of a man who looks me in the eye every month and calls me friend."
He did more than take money, Genevieve said. She spread 3 deposit slips across the table. "Look at these. The signatures authorizing the transfers into Fairlie's account are not your father's. They are Fairlie's own. He had signatory power on these ventures. He was withdrawing funds directly. Your father may have recruited the investors and built the scheme, but Fairlie managed the accounts. He moved the money. He kept the books clean enough to avoid detection for over a decade." Lysander turned around. His face was very still, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides.
"My father's journal mentioned no partner. Every entry was written as though he acted alone."
Perhaps he was protecting Fairlie, or perhaps Fairlie was careful enough to keep his involvement out of your father's personal records. Either way, the banking documents are clear. Fairlie was not a passive beneficiary. He was an active participant. Lysander walked back to the table and sat down heavily. He picked up one of the deposit slips and studied Fairlie's signature. It was a confident hand, broad strokes with a flourish on the final letter. The signature of a man who had never worried about being caught. £5,800, Lysander repeated. "Which means £5,800 of the debt you are carrying does not belong to you. It belongs to him." Lysander set the slip down and looked at her across the table. The lantern light flickered between them.
"What do you propose?"
Genevieve opened her notebook to a fresh page. "We restructure everything. Your repayment calculations, your timelines, your projected losses. We separate your father's share of the fraud from Fairlie's, and then we give Fairlie a choice."
"What kind of choice?"
Genevieve met his gaze steadily. "The kind that keeps his name out of the public record, but only if he does the right thing. If he returns what he took, quietly and completely, then the matter stays between us. If he refuses, then every document in this vault goes to the guild, the bank, and the broadsheets." Lysander considered this for a long time. The vault was silent, except for the faint hiss of the lantern flames. "He will be at the Mayfair ball in 3 days, Lysander said. "Then we have 3 days to prepare." Genevieve picked up her pen and began to write.
The Mayfair ballroom belonged to the Countess of Devereux, who hosted her spring gathering every April with the kind of ruthless precision that would have served well in military command. 400 candles burned in 3 enormous chandeliers. An orchestra of 12 played from a raised platform draped in gold cloth. Footmen in matching ivory coats circled the room with trays of champagne and sugared fruits. The flowers alone, white roses and trailing ivy shipped from a glasshouse in Kent, had cost more than most families earned in a year. Every titled family in London had received an invitation. Every titled family had accepted. And tonight, for the first time in 14 months, Duke Lysander Vance had come. The reaction was immediate. He appeared in the doorway at 8:30, dressed in a black evening coat with a white silk cravat, and the room shifted like a compass needle finding north. Conversations paused. Fans stopped fluttering. Heads turned in a slow wave that swept from the entrance to the far corners of the ballroom. The whispers began before he had taken 3 steps. "He has come back. I knew this would be the season. Look at him. He looks thinner, more serious.
Something has changed. Lady Lucinda Ashworth was among the first to approach. She materialized at his elbow within minutes, wearing a gown of pale gold silk, with her hair arranged in an elaborate tower of curls and tiny seed pearls. Two of her constant companions flanked her at a respectful distance, like attendants at a royal audience. "Your Grace," she said, her voice pitched perfectly between surprise and delight. "What a wonderful pleasure. We had all but given up hope of seeing you this season." Lysander smiled. It was the practiced, hollow smile Genevieve had seen on his face the first morning at Oakhaven, the one that gave away nothing.
Lady Lucinda, you look well. And you look as though you have been carrying the weight of the world, but perhaps tonight we can persuade you to set it down for a few hours. She placed her gloved hand on his arm with the casual possessiveness of a woman who had already decided he belonged to her. Lysander allowed it. He allowed the introductions, the congratulations on his return to society, the gentle interrogations disguised as concern. He moved through the room like a man performing a role he had rehearsed, shaking hands and accepting compliments and deflecting every question about his long absence with vague references to estate matters and the demands of the country. Nobody pressed further. They did not want the truth. They wanted the story. The lonely Duke, finally emerging from his grief, ready to love again. It was too perfect a narrative to ruin with inconvenient questions. Genevieve watched from the far side of the ballroom. She had entered through the servants' corridor 20 minutes before Lysander's arrival, using an access pass provided by the Countess's head butler, who owed a favor to Halford's bank. She wore a borrowed dress, dark blue cotton that was respectable enough to avoid suspicion, but plain enough to ensure nobody looked at her twice. She carried a small leather folder pressed flat against her side, tucked beneath a shawl. Inside the folder was a document she had spent 3 days preparing. It was a complete accounting of Sir Edmund Fairlie's involvement in the late Duke's fraud. Every venture, every withdrawal, every signature. The figures were cross-referenced against guild records, banking ledgers, and deposit slips. The document also included a formal demand for the return of £5,800 to a restitution fund, payable within 60 days. At the bottom of the final page, a single paragraph outlined the alternative. If the sum was not returned, the complete record of Fairlie's participation would be submitted to the Merchant Traders Guild, the Bank of England's Oversight Commission, and 3 London newspapers. It was, Genevieve thought, a very polite document, the kind of politeness that carried a blade inside the envelope. She spotted Fairlie near the orchestra platform. He was a man of about 60, broad-shouldered and well-fed, with a red face and white side whiskers that gave him the appearance of a prosperous country squire. He wore an expensive burgundy coat with gold buttons and laughed loudly at something a younger man beside him had said. A glass of champagne sat comfortably in his hand, his third of the evening by Genevieve's count. He looked, she thought, like a man who slept very well at night. She waited until he separated from his group and moved toward the refreshment table. She crossed the room at an angle, arriving beside him just as he reached for a plate of cold pheasant. "Sir Edmund Fairlie," she said. He turned and looked at her with the mild, unfocused curiosity of a man who could not immediately determine whether she was worth his attention. "Yes?" "My name is Genevieve Thorne. I am a ledger auditor working on behalf of the Bank of Whitmore and Sons. I have been retained to examine the financial affairs of the Vance estate." Something shifted behind Fairlie's eyes. A small adjustment, like a door being pulled slightly closed. "I see," he said pleasantly. "And what brings you to a ball, Miss Thorne? Surely the music is not to be found in the account books." "I will only take a moment of your time." She drew the leather folder from beneath her shawl and held it out to him. "This document contains a full record of your financial involvement in 6 investment ventures operated by the late Duke Aldrich Vance between 1802 and 1810. It also contains a formal request for the return of funds that were withdrawn under your personal authority." Fairlie did not take the folder. His champagne glass hung motionless in his hand.
The pleasant expression remained fixed on his face, but the color beneath it had begun to change, the ruddy warmth draining slowly toward gray. "I suggest you read it privately," Genevieve continued. "The terms are straightforward. You will find a return address on the final page. I would appreciate a response within the week." She placed the folder on the refreshment table beside his plate, turned, and walked away. She did not look back. She crossed the ballroom, passed through the servants' corridor, and stepped out into the cool night air of the courtyard. Her hands were trembling slightly, the way they always did after she delivered bad news to powerful men. Above her, through the tall windows, the ballroom glowed golden. She could hear the orchestra beginning a waltz. Somewhere inside, Lysander was still smiling his empty smile and pretending that everything was fine. But the document was delivered. The numbers were on the table, and Sir Edmund Fairley now had a choice that no amount of champagne and cold pheasant could wash away. The drawing room at the Countess of Devereux's townhouse overlooked a small private park where nursemaids walked with their charges and old men fed pigeons from iron benches. It was a handsome room, tall windows with cream curtains, furniture arranged in careful groupings that encouraged intimate conversation. The Countess had offered it for the afternoon gathering because she adored Lysander and because she believed, like everyone else, that today would be the day the lonely Duke finally announced something worth celebrating. She was half right. The room held perhaps 40 guests, a carefully selected assembly of London's finest. Titled families, prominent merchants, 2 magistrates, a retired admiral, and a dense cluster of eligible young women who had positioned themselves near the fireplace where the light was most flattering. Lady Lucinda stood among them, radiant in pale green silk, her confidence visible from across the room. She had told at least 3 people that morning that she expected a significant development today. Sir Edmund Fairley was also present. He stood near the window with a glass of sherry, speaking to a wool merchant about nothing consequential. He appeared composed. His burgundy coat was freshly pressed, his side whiskers neatly trimmed, his posture relaxed. To anyone watching, he was the picture of a comfortable gentleman enjoying a pleasant afternoon. Genevieve, standing near the doorway with her document case, noticed that he had not touched his sherry once. Lysander arrived at 2:30. He entered the drawing room, and the chatter dipped the way it always did when he appeared somewhere. That brief collective intake of breath that followed him like a shadow. The Countess greeted him warmly. Several guests moved toward him with outstretched hands and practiced smiles. He accepted their greetings with patience. He exchanged pleasantries with the Admiral. He complimented the Countess on her flowers. He did everything that was expected of a duke returning to society. Then he asked if he might have the room's attention. The conversations faded. Guests turned to face him. Lady Lucinda straightened her posture and tilted her chin upward with the quiet assurance of a woman who believed the next few minutes would change her life. Lysander stood near the center of the room. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way Genevieve had heard him speak in his carriage on the road to London, steady and deliberate, like a man choosing each word with the care of someone who understood that words, once spoken, cannot be gathered back. "I want to thank the Countess for her hospitality," he began, "and I want to thank all of you for your kindness over the past year. Many of you have written to me, many of you have extended invitations that I was unable to accept. I know that my absence from society has caused speculation, and I know that the stories people have told about my reasons have been, in most cases, far more romantic than the truth." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room. Lady Lucinda smiled. "The truth," Lysander continued, "is that I have spent the past 14 months dealing with a matter of family honor. My father, the late Duke Aldrich Vance, was a man many of you knew and admired. He was charming, generous, and widely respected. He was also, I am sorry to say, dishonest." The laughter stopped. "Over a period of 12 years, my father solicited private investments from tradesmen, merchants, and families of modest means. He used the credibility of his title and the trust of his friendships to persuade honest people to give him their savings.
He promised them returns on ventures that did not exist. He took their money and used it to maintain his estate, his reputation, and his position in society. The room had gone completely silent. Lady Lucinda's smile had frozen on her face like something painted on porcelain. The wool merchant near the window set down his glass. Fairley had gone very still. When I discovered the truth after his death, I made a decision, Lysander said. I would return every penny that was taken, every pound, every shilling. I have been doing so for the past 11 months, quietly and anonymously, out of my own inheritance. He paused and let the weight of it settle across the room. As of this morning, I have authorized the complete liquidation of the Oakhaven estate. The manor, the land, the furnishings, the carriages, the horses, everything my family has accumulated over 2 centuries will be sold at public auction. The proceeds will go directly to the families my father defrauded. When the process is complete, the Vance fortune will cease to exist. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly in the silence. Genevieve watched the faces around the room change. She saw the exact moment when the romantic fantasy shattered, when the story of the lonely Duke waiting for love collapsed under the reality of a man announcing his own financial ruin. The expressions shifted one by one, from admiration to confusion, from confusion to discomfort, from discomfort to something harder and colder. Disappointment, calculation, withdrawal. Lady Lucinda's gloved hand drifted slowly away from the arm of her chair. The young women near the fireplace exchanged glances that needed no words. The retired admiral studied his shoes with sudden fascination. They were already leaving, some of them physically, edging toward the doorway with murmured apologies, others simply retreating behind their eyes, closing whatever door they had opened for Lysander the moment they realized that behind it there was no fortune, no estate, no grand proposal, just a man with empty pockets and a clear conscience. Fairley moved toward the door. He walked quickly, his head down, his sherry glass abandoned on the windowsill. As he passed Genevieve, she caught his eye. He stopped for half a step. Something passed across his face, a calculation so rapid it was nearly invisible. Fear weighed against pride, self-preservation measured against exposure. Then he was gone, through the doorway and down the stairs, his footsteps fading into the afternoon. Lysander stood alone in the center of the drawing room. The Countess remained in her chair, her expression unreadable. A handful of guests lingered near the walls, unsure whether to stay or follow the others. Genevieve crossed the room and stood beside him. She did not touch his arm or offer words of comfort or tell him he had done the right thing. He already knew that. He had known it for 11 months. She simply stood there, close enough that he could see he was not alone in the wreckage, and waited for whatever came next. The auction house on King Street had seen better merchandise, but it had rarely seen a larger crowd. By 9 in the morning, the pavements outside were thick with onlookers. Carriages lined the surrounding streets in both directions. Street vendors had set up along the curb, selling roasted chestnuts and printed broadsheets, because London never missed an opportunity to turn someone's misfortune into entertainment. The broadsheets were selling particularly well. 3 different papers had run the story overnight. Duke empties estate to repay father's debts. The Vance fortune, a legacy of fraud and redemption. Lonely Duke no more, society's favorite bachelor revealed as a pauper. The headlines were unkind. The articles beneath them were worse. Every column treated the story as a scandal rather than a sacrifice, focusing on the dramatic fall of a wealthy family rather than the reason behind it. One paper devoted an entire paragraph to cataloguing the young women who had pursued Lysander over the past year, listing them by name alongside estimated dowries, as though the whole affair were a horse race in which every rider had bet on the wrong animal. Genevieve had read them all before breakfast and set them aside without comment.
Inside the auction house, the main hall had been arranged with rows of wooden chairs facing a raised platform where the auctioneer stood behind a tall oak lectern. Along both walls, tables displayed the items to be sold. Silver candlesticks from the Oakhaven dining room, a matched set of mahogany side tables, hunting prints in gilded frames, porcelain from the breakfast room, crystal decanters, writing desks, mantel clocks. A Persian carpet so large it had to be rolled and propped against the back wall like a fallen column. Everything carried a small numbered card and a description written in the auctioneer's careful hand. Lysander's entire life, measured and tagged and ready to be sold to the highest bidder. He arrived at 9:15 through a side door, avoiding the crowd at the front. Genevieve was already inside, seated in the last row with her notebook open. She had spent the previous 5 days working with Lysander and a solicitor named Hargreaves to finalize the liquidation. Every asset had been catalogued, appraised, and cleared for sale. The proceeds would be deposited into a dedicated restitution account held at the Bank of Whitmore and Sons, managed by Genevieve herself, and dispersed to the remaining families on Lysander's list. The legal structure was clean. The arithmetic was final. There was nothing left to do except watch it happen. Lysander sat down beside her. He wore a simple grey coat, no waistcoat, no cravat pin, no signet ring. He had sold the ring 3 days ago. It had belonged to his grandfather and had fetched £11 at a private jeweller on Bond Street. "Hargreaves tells me the reserve prices are fair," he said quietly. "They are conservative," Genevieve replied. "The silver alone should exceed estimates. Your family had excellent taste in craftsmanship, whatever their other failings." A thin smile crossed his face. "My mother chose the silver. She had no part in any of this." "Then she would be glad to know it is being put to good use." The auctioneer called the room to order. The crowd settled into their chairs. Bidding paddles were raised and inspected. A clerk at the side of the platform prepared to record each sale. The first lot was a pair of Georgian silver candelabra. Bidding opened at £8 and climbed quickly to 14. A dealer in the third row won them with a sharp nod. The second lot was the mahogany writing desk from Lysander's study. Genevieve watched him as the bidding began. His expression did not change, but his left hand rested flat on his knee, fingers pressed hard against the fabric of his trousers, as though anchoring himself to the chair. The desk sold for £22. Lot after lot followed. The porcelain went to a collector from Bath. The hunting prints sold in a single block to a gentleman who planned to hang them in his country house in Hampshire. The Persian carpet drew enthusiastic bidding from 3 separate parties and eventually sold for a sum that made the auctioneer raise his eyebrows. By midday, the tables along the walls were nearly bare. The final lot was a carriage, a handsome black brougham with the Vance family crest painted on the doors in gold leaf. It had carried Lysander's father to Parliament, to court, to the private dinners where he had charmed honest men out of their savings. It was the last physical object bearing the Vance name. It sold for £31 to a livery company in Southwark that would sand off the crest and repaint the doors within the week. The auctioneer struck his gavel for the last time. The clerk tallied the final column. Genevieve checked the figure against her projections and made a small notation in her notebook. The total proceeds, combined with the payments Lysander had already made over the past year, covered the full amount owed to every defrauded family. Pound for pound, shilling for shilling. The debt was cleared. Genevieve closed her notebook and turned to Lysander. He was sitting very still, staring at the empty platform where his family's possessions had been displayed an hour ago. The hall was emptying around them. Buyers were collecting their purchases. The auctioneer was packing his gavel into a velvet-lined case. Porters carried the last remaining items toward the loading entrance at the rear. "It is done," Genevieve said. Lysander nodded slowly. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he drew a breath, deep and unsteady,
The kind of breath a man takes when a weight he has been carrying for so long he had forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it is finally lifted. "My father spent 20 years building a fortune on lies," he said. "It took me 14 months to give it all back." He looked at his empty hands. "I own nothing. No estate, no carriage, no silver, no name worth trading on." "You own something," Genevieve said. He looked at her. "A clear ledger," she said. "Every account settled, every debt honored, every family repaid. There is not a single entry left outstanding." Lysander held her gaze for a long time. The auction hall was nearly empty now. Afternoon light came through the high windows and fell across the bare wooden floor where the carpet had been. He stood up. He buttoned his plain grey coat, and for the first time in 14 months, he walked out of a room without anything to hide. The office occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse on Wapping High Street, overlooking the Thames where it curved south toward Rotherhithe. It was a modest space. 2 rooms separated by a wooden partition, a pair of desks facing each other near the front window, shelves along the back wall holding ledgers, reference books, and a growing collection of client files bound in brown paper. A coal stove in the corner that worked adequately on calm days and smoked terribly when the river wind blew from the east. The sign above the street door read Thorne & Associates, Independent Auditing and Mercantile Accounting. It had been painted by a sign-maker on Narrow Street, who charged 2 shillings for the work and threw in a second coat of varnish because he liked the look of it. Genevieve had opened the firm 18 months ago with savings from her previous work and a client list of exactly 4. She now had 11, mostly small trading companies and independent merchants who needed their books examined before the quarterly tax filings. The work was steady, the pay was reasonable, and she answered to nobody except herself. The 12th client had arrived 4 days ago. Lysander sat at the second desk, his coat hung on a peg by the door, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, working through a stack of shipping invoices for a tea importer based in Limehouse. He had a pen in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other, and he was frowning at a column of figures that refused to reconcile. "This man has been charging his own company for storage fees at a warehouse he also owns," he said, holding up an invoice. "He is paying himself to hold his own merchandise." "That is called creative accounting," Genevieve said from behind her own desk without looking up. "It is also called fraud, depending on how creative he has been. Flag it, and we will review the full ledger this afternoon." Lysander marked the invoice with a pencil notation and set it aside. He picked up the next one and continued working. This was the shape of his days now. He rose early at a boarding house on Cable Street where he rented a single room for 6 shillings a week. He walked to the office along the river, bought bread and coffee from a street cart near the Prospect of Whitby, and arrived at his desk by 8. He worked until evening, learning the trade of auditing with the same focused determination he had once applied to dismantling his own inheritance. He made errors. Genevieve corrected them. He asked questions. She answered them with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for years and did not believe in cushioning lessons with flattery. He was, she had to admit, a surprisingly quick study. The Vance estate was gone. Oakhaven Manor had been sold to a textile manufacturer from Manchester who planned to convert the ground floor into a warehouse. The title remained, technically. Lysander was still the Duke of Vance in the eyes of the law and the peerage registers, but a title without land, without income, without the social machinery that gave it weight, was little more than a word. London society had processed his fall with remarkable speed. The gossip columns had feasted on the story for a week, dissecting every detail with the enthusiastic cruelty that only bored aristocrats could sustain. Then a minor royal had eloped with an actress, and the papers moved on. Lysander Vance became old news. The women who had once schemed to win his hand now pretended they had never been interested. Lady Lucinda had been seen at a garden party in Richmond on the arm of a viscount from Surrey, laughing as though the name Vance had never crossed her lips. The world had a short memory for men who could no longer afford to be interesting. Fairlie's resolution had come quietly, as Genevieve had expected it would. 9 days after the Mayfair ball, a solicitor representing Sir Edmund Fairlie had delivered a bank draft for £5,800 to the offices of the Bank of Whitmore & Sons, accompanied by a brief letter acknowledging an outstanding financial obligation to the Vance estate. No admission of fraud, no public statement, no apology. Simply the money, returned in full, with the unspoken understanding that the documents in Genevieve's possession would remain in her possession. She had deposited the draft into the restitution account and disbursed the final payments to the remaining families on Lysander's list within the week. The ledger was closed, every entry balanced, every name accounted for. She had kept copies of the Fairlie documents in a locked drawer at the office. Insurance, she called it. Lysander had not objected. The clock on the wall showed 12:30. Genevieve set down her pen and stretched her shoulders. Through the window, the Thames was busy with midday traffic. Barges moved slowly upstream, loaded with coal and timber. A passenger wherry cut across the current, carrying clerks back from their lunch break on the south bank. Gulls circled the masts of a merchant ship anchored near the custom house. "There is a new inquiry from a solicitor in Cheapside," Genevieve said, reaching for a letter on her desk. "A linen draper suspects his business partner has been skimming profits through a false supplier account. He wants a full audit of 3 years of records." "How large is the business?" "Moderate, perhaps 2,000 a year in revenue. The disputed amount is somewhere around £300. Lysander considered this. Enough to ruin a small partnership. Enough to ruin a friendship, which is usually worse. He nodded. "When does he want us to start?" "Monday. I will handle the initial interview. You can begin on the ledgers once I have the documents in hand." "Agreed." Genevieve folded the letter and placed it in the new client tray. She looked across the office at Lysander, who had already returned to his stack of shipping invoices, his pen moving steadily across the page. A month ago, he had been the most talked-about man in England. Every drawing room had whispered his name. Every ballroom had held its breath when he entered. Women had competed for his glance, his hand, his fortune. Now he sat at a second-hand desk in a drafty warehouse office, auditing tea invoices for a Limehouse importer, and he looked more at ease than she had ever seen him. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Outside the window, the river carried on. Ships came and went. The city hummed with its endless commerce of ambition and appetite. And in a small office above the docks, 2 people who had found each other through a hidden vault and a buried truth did the quiet, ordinary, unremarkable work of building something honest. It was enough.